For more on the race for the White House, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from New York is Nomiki Konst. She's a Democratic strategist and the host of the podcast, The Nomiki Show. Also with us from California is Spencer Critchley. He's a Democratic strategist and the managing partner of Boots Road Group. Here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Sery Kim. She's a Republican strategist and former senior advisor in the Trump administration. And from Durham, North Hampshire, Andrew Smith is director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Andrew Smith, let me start with you, and let's begin with Tuesday's New Hampshire primary, a narrow win for the Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. Here is part of his victory speech.
And what I can tell you with absolute certainty, and I know I speak for every one of the Democratic candidates, is that no matter who wins, and we certainly hope it's going to be us, we are going to unite together. We are going to unite together and defeat the most dangerous president in the modern history of this country.
So, Andrew, firstly, what was your main takeaway from the race in New Hampshire?
The main takeaway is that Bernie Sanders was extremely lucky. Amy Klobuchar caught fire at the very end. Klobuchar took votes away from both Biden and Pete Buttigieg. If she had not caught fire after that last debate, I think we would be talking about the winner being Pete Buttigieg tonight going forward into Nevada. I think that was one of the most interesting things. Obviously, Joe Biden finishing fifth, not particularly surprising, but it may be the end of his campaign.
Sanders got more votes than Pete Buttigieg, both in Iowa and in New Hampshire, but in New Hampshire, they both got the same number of delegates. For our foreign audience, explain that to us. How does that work?
Well, these guys are really campaigning for delegates for the Democratic National Convention. But that said, Iowa and New Hampshire are not important for the number of delegates that you win here. It's really that it's important that a candidate shows the ability that they can win an election in New Hampshire and in Iowa, because that demonstrates to those voters in subsequent states that they're viable candidates, that they can win. And ultimately, what Democrats want in November is a candidate that can beat Donald Trump. And to demonstrate that they can win, they have to demonstrate that they can win in these earlier races. So it's the momentum that you get from winning Iowa and winning, and more importantly, winning New Hampshire, that is far more important than the few delegates that you win in those two states.
All right, let's go to New York. Let's go to Nomiki. Nomiki, you support Bernie Sanders. Were you surprised by the strong showing by Pete Buttigieg?
I wasn't as surprised given his showing in Iowa. I mean, if for those of you who have not been following this as closely as most of us in progressive politics, in presidential politics have, Pete Buttigieg has put a tremendous amount of money in Iowa and the infrastructure in Iowa. He has not done so pretty much in any other state. So he had all of his bets on Iowa, and of course, there were several senators who were taken to Washington during impeachment. So, in the last week, that jump for him gave him, almost 10 points from where he was, 2 weeks ago in New Hampshire. The difference is, in Iowa and New Hampshire, these are very small states. They're easy to get around geographically. You can do this thing called big organizing, where you have big rallies and voters turn out. It is much easier to campaign in those states and concentrate your money and get more bang for your buck. He's really going to have difficulty moving forward because he doesn't have African-American support at all. He has very little Latino support, and the majority of the Democratic base moving forward into Super Tuesday, whether it's Texas, Nevada, which is just in a couple of weeks, or California, relies on people of color. So moving forward, this is really about who has not only the resources for very expensive states to organize on the ground and buy ads, but also who has the organization on the ground. And that is why I think Bernie Sanders moving forward is really going to become the clear victor, if not Bloomberg, who might stand in his way.
Right, Nomiki, we also saw a very strong challenge by Amy Klobuchar. Here she is talking after the vote. Let's watch this.
Donald Trump's worst nightmare is that the people in the middle, the people who have had enough of the name calling and the mudslinging, have someone to vote for in November.
So, Nomiki, what do you attribute to Klobuchar's success in New Hampshire?
I have to disagree with the other panelists because I think really Amy Klobuchar rose at a time when Elizabeth Warren's campaign has not been able to pick up the momentum that she needed. Warren moved a little bit more to the right in order to pull from Joe Biden, to pull from Pete Buttigieg, and it just wasn't working. So, you know, Bernie Sanders has always had a populist, progressive base. He was not able to attract some of the older voters. When you look at the numbers, the early numbers in from Iowa and New Hampshire that he had last time around. So I think that's something for him to consider, that maybe Amy Klobuchar pulled from that, maybe even Pete Buttigieg pulled from that base. But I really think that Amy Klobuchar is an effect of Elizabeth Warren.
Spencer, let's talk about Joe Biden. Andrew mentioned him a moment ago. He's the former vice president. He finished 5th. He's a moderate. He was the big hope for the Democratic Party establishment. Do you think he has a future in this race?
I think he's in very serious trouble, and it's very surprising to, well, anybody who knows Joe Biden, anybody who's worked around him loves him and also respects him. He's incredibly accomplished, which often gets lost in the sort of Uncle Joe image. But, you know, his management of the Recovery Act, for example, was masterly. It was one of the most successful and waste and fraud-free government programs in history. However, you would think that he would have learned how to run a campaign better, and I have to say I'm mystified by the way he ran his campaign, and I think he has to take responsibility for that. It's going to take a dramatic turnaround to make this work out for him. I would also say that the results we've seen so far, while we should always be prepared for surprises, when you look at what happened, it reaffirms that the fundamentals are what matter. Bernie Sanders is a very strong campaigner. He's really strong on all of the fundamentals. And by that, I mean he has a very clear, emotional, focused message. You get the strong sense that he's authentic, that he's going to fight for you. He's got tremendous field organizing. He does all the things you're supposed to do. And I would say that's also true of Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar. These successful candidates are taking care of the fundamentals. I'd also say most voters really don't care about ideology. So moving left or right ideologically, really, it only makes difference to people like us. The average voter really is often kind of incoherent ideologically, which is why you see some people will vote for a Trump after having voted for an Obama, which makes no sense whatsoever. But really it's because they have that sense that this person, rightly or wrongly, they have this sense, this person's going to fight for me, and I think that's what really matters.
Very quickly, Spencer, you raise a point there about Biden's experience. You mentioned the Recovery Act. Biden himself has mentioned his role in passing the Affordable Care Act, his role in the Iran nuclear deal, so that's foreign policy experience. Why has he not been able to translate that into success at the polls?
It's that lack of coherent messaging. You know, there's research that shows that the connection a candidate makes with voters happens in a fraction of a second. There's fascinating research in particular by a researcher named Alexei Todorov at Princeton that shows that very often people make judgments that end up sticking within like 1/10 of a second or less. We saw that with Obama. We've seen it with other figures like Bill Clinton or Ronald Reagan who make that connection with voters. These lists of policy points are not going to do it for you. And I think that Biden so far has not put forward the simple, emotional, one-sentence statement of why he's doing this. It's tended to consist of, I can beat Trump. And heaven knows that's critically important. I think all Democrats agree, and many, frankly, conservatives agree too. Right. But he needs to take it farther than that. And I think that Sanders, for example, Klobuchar, Buttigieg, these are examples, and Yang, who I just think people didn't quite understand, although I think he was making some important points. They had really and have really focused messages, and then they take care of the nuts and bolts of organizing and doing all the stuff you just have to do. And I just don't think Joe Biden has done that stuff so far.
All right, let's bring it to the studio. Sery Kim, you're in the very fortunate position of sitting here on the outside looking in. What did you make of the Democratic race?
Well, I think there are two important takeaways from last night, one for the Democrats and one for the Republicans. First and foremost, every Democrat that spoke last night and every one of the panelists today, they failed to mention the fact that it is President Trump. You are going against an incumbent president and all the trappings of that. And the most important statistic that came away last night is that Trump won the New Hampshire primary at 120,000 1,000 votes. President Obama, in his incumbent bid, only had 46,000. Bush, 53,000. Clinton, 76,000. Ronald Reagan himself only had 65,000. So these Democrats, they forget that when you go against Trump, you are trying to beat the White House. And for Republicans, they forgot last night as they were gleefully rejoicing over the fact that the Democrats are still not able to pick their nominee. We have not defined what socialism is. Socialism has been in the United States since the turn of the 20th century with Eugene Debs. Socialists have been successful. Almost 50,000 Americans have decided that they are socialist. Is Bernie Sanders a cuddly socialist? Is he a Cuba socialist? What does that mean? And if the Republican Party lets Bernie Sanders go into Nevada and South Carolina without defining it, he's going to walk away the friendly guy.
Well, that's a challenge for him. Andrew Smith, we often hear the term electability being bandied around, meaning who has the best shot at defeating Donald Trump. It used to be Biden, but of course he's not doing so well right now. Whom do you think is the most electable candidate right now?
Well, right now our polling is showing that it's Bernie Sanders, and it's amazingly how quick that perception changes. Once Biden lost badly in Iowa, the percentage of Democrats here in New Hampshire who said he was the most electable candidate dropped about 20 percentage points. This is why I'm saying the sequential nature of the nomination process is critical. Winning in the early states demonstrates that you can win and that you are electable, and losing means that you are not electable. It's almost as simple as that in the minds of a lot of voters. And going forward beyond New Hampshire, the campaigns that they were able to organize in Iowa and New Hampshire with people on the ground knocking on doors and ringing and making phone calls just isn't going to be able to happen. They don't have the time or the money to build that kind of an infrastructure as quickly, and it's going to rely on the commercials and large rallies and speeches. Yeah. And those are things that benefit the candidate with energy and emotion and electability.
What about Mike Bloomberg, Andrew, the former mayor of New York? He's risen up very quickly in the polls. We haven't seen him in any of these races so far. He's only going to get in on Super Tuesday when we have those whole host of states that are going to be voting. He's also, when we look at individual matchups between the Democratic contenders and President Trump, he has the highest, well, the gap is the biggest with him. It's 9 points. He beats President Trump by 9 points. Bernie Sanders beats President Trump by 8 points. What about him?
Oh, I think, first of all, it's important to remember that Bloomberg is campaigning in a vacuum. The other campaigns are not spending money in those other states like he is. Secondly, he's still everybody's kind of a white knight. They put their hopes and dreams on Michael Bloomberg to come in and rescue the Democratic Party from the evil Trump. And when he gets into campaigns, when he actually gets on a stage, a debate stage with Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, he's going to become a very different candidate. He's going to become a real person, not just this fictitious image that we have of Mike Bloomberg, the guy who's going to save the day.
Nomiki, I'm going to get back to something Sery Kim said a moment ago, and that is Bernie Sanders. He calls himself a democratic socialist, but how much of a liability is that for him? Because the term socialist is going to be used against him, isn't it?
You know, Bernie Sanders is a very smart senator who's been in this industry for a long time, and he's identified as a democratic socialist for 35, 40 years. With that being said, he also has very smart strategists. I think something that people maybe on the Trump side and the Republican Party are not aware of is that the negative connotation that worked in the 80s for democratic socialism is not working on this generation of voters. And I'm not just talking about young people, I'm talking about people over the age of 50. It doesn't have the same imagery. I mean, when you mention Cuba, most people say, okay, and that's not, I mean, and most people are also smart enough to understand there's a difference between Bernie Sanders and Fidel Castro and communism and socialism. I think, you know, Bernie has been able to talk about the issues and how Medicare for All is something that is going to impact and make your life better. And that is why Medicare for All polls among all the issues the highest. So, you know, on one hand, yes, it is about, do you trust the candidate? Is this somebody who can defeat Donald Trump? But it is also about what that candidate represents. And so when you look at someone like Michael Bloomberg, who I think in the end when you get to these later states, as I mentioned before, much more expensive states like Texas and California, Michael Bloomberg doesn't have that. I'm a New Yorker. People in New York know the legacy of Michael Bloomberg. When he gets on stage, when we go back and you look at those debates from just a few years ago when he ran for mayor, he did not do well under pressure. And that will be highlighted and exposed, and his record will be exposed as a former Republican.
But this is where it's really important. The key adverb that she used is represent. What does Bernie Sanders represent? 35 years of passing no laws. What does Bernie Sanders' socialism represent? Nothing at all. Reform. And so this is where I think, excuse me, I let you speak. You need to let me speak.
Yeah, but I didn't lie.
And so,
Nomiki, I will get to you.
So this is where Senator Sanders has been not effective in advancing his brand and his ideology. And when you are looking at the Democratic standard bearer, and when you're looking at the fact that they're going to match up with Trump, regardless of what you think, is effective.
Okay, Nomiki, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this is comical because if Donald Trump thinks he's going to get away with campaigning against Bernie Sanders like he did with Hillary Clinton or with the 9 Republicans that ran, that's just not going to work. You're talking about
what didn't work?
One moment.
You're talking about a movement that is the most educated generation in history. His base is millennials who are feeling the effects of all of the things that the Republican Party has been fighting against: deregulation, tax reform for the wealthy, making sure that students are in debt. The rhetoric from Donald Trump and his actual record of going bankrupt multiple times. I mean, Bloomberg himself will go on stage and say, you know, this man is a fraud. If you want to talk about the legacy, all you've done while you've been in the presidency is make sure that this country is unstable and that you've got tax breaks for oligarchs. So I bet you when he goes on stage and he debates any of those Democrats, his record is going to be right there, very clear. You're losing Republicans day by day. You're losing independents to Bernie Sanders, as we see in the polls. You've got a lot more to be concerned about than Bernie Sanders' legislative record, which is very strong.
All right, I want to get to Spencer, because Spencer, this whole the controversy over socialism. You've written about this, and you say people tend to mix socialism with democratic socialism. Why is Bernie Sanders, Spencer, having difficulty explaining this?
Yeah, I thank you for that reference. I hope people will go to spencercritchley.com and read the piece, because it takes a while to work this through. You know, I always say Democrats are great at substance and terrible at branding. And I have to say, I agree with some of what Sery was just saying, and I think that the left makes a mistake not to listen sometimes when the right is actually telling us something about how they beat us in elections when they shouldn't be able to beat us. The problem with Bernie is, I think Bernie is a great person. He's got great values. He's very smart. He's got great integrity. I'm confused about why he insists on calling himself a democratic socialist. Even democratic socialists say he's not a democratic socialist, because most of them say, yes, we are socialists. What Bernie really is a progressive in the FDR model, or in European terms, he's a social democrat. It sounds similar, but from branding point of view, there's a critical difference. When most of Bernie's supporters talk about what he wants to do, they point to models like Denmark or Finland. Those countries are not socialist countries. None of the examples they point to are socialist countries. The ones they're pointing to are social democracies. The author Tony Judt, lifelong socialist who converted to social democracy later in his life, is great on this subject, by the way. The difference is that there's a technical definition of socialism, and it is scary to most Americans, and the polls show that. And that involves a centrally planned economy, and it involves reductions in freedom that most Americans have never experienced. If you have a centrally planned economy, whether you think that's a good idea or not, it means the government's telling you you can't be in this business, for example. And the polls, it's just data, shows most Americans don't like that. And a general election is very different from a primary. Also, and so that's what Bernie's going to face if he's the nominee. So I don't understand the confusion about insisting on calling himself democratic socialist when he's actually a social democrat. Also, in terms of, you know, fighting back against Trump and the Republicans, they've beaten us at this multiple times. Hillary Clinton was the most popular public figure in the world, I believe, when she was Secretary of State, certainly the United States. They started the bogus Benghazi investigation. tore her poll numbers apart, as Kevin McCarthy boasted, and then dropped the investigations the moment Trump got elected. That's going to happen again, and I hope Bernie Sanders, if he is the nominee, I want him to win. I hope he's ready for that.
Okay. Andrew, there was a piece in the New York Times today, this morning, an analysis, and it posed the question, who won in New Hampshire? And then it answers the question by saying not the establishment. It points to the poor performance by Elizabeth Warren and Joe Biden. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, both on the Democratic side, but on the Republican side as well, because Donald Trump certainly doesn't represent the Republican Party establishment as we typically think of it. But boy, his win there yesterday, I think, really put down a marker, as some of the earlier guests had talked about. That margin of victory was almost as great as Ronald Reagan's in 1984, and the enthusiasm that Republicans had coming out to a rally here in Manchester, staying out in the rain and the cold and the snow for 2 days to get in to see Donald Trump, is something that has been going on across the country. The enthusiasm we see is on the Republican side. So I think coming out of this, you still see a muddled field and a muddled path forward for Democrats, who are going to now start fighting more bitterly against one another, while Donald Trump is solidifying the Republican base.
Nomiki, there's another problem that Bernie Sanders has, and that is most of the big stream media, the established media in the country, don't like him. The New Republic had a piece which says cable news networks, particularly the quote-unquote liberal one, that was a reference to MSNBC, are a growing barrier to his surging campaign. How big a problem is that going to be for him?
I think he's been able to out-navigate the cable news complex, the industrial complex of the cable news industry, very well over the past few years. You know, this is something obviously that Donald Trump, you know, the cable news industry didn't like Donald Trump either, with exception to parts of Fox News. I think that speaks well to the voters. I mean, thank God we have the internet. Thank God that there's this ecosystem of podcasters and YouTube shows that are very well watched, sometimes even have more views per episode than MSNBC in primetime, where he can get his message out. And I think he's been relying heavily on that. And it's going to work for him, possibly even in the general election, as more people are unplugging. I mean, just yesterday we saw a clip on MSNBC of Ari Melber interviewing somebody in New Hampshire saying she's supporting Bernie Sanders because of the way MSNBC treated Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, I saw that.
So there is something there. There is something there. It's good in the era of anti-establishment, not trusting institutions. It's something that Donald Trump played off. I don't think it's something that Michael Bloomberg, as an independent or a former Republican, can play off of. I think it's something unique to Bernie Sanders and his movement of young people who are disconnected from cable news.
Sery, let's get back to President Trump. He has called the Democratic challenges weak. That's what he said. But according to some experts, and if you read a lot of the analysis we see these days, he needs to win suburban voters who've been turned off by his politics and his behavior. How does he get them back?
Well, those are two bifurcated things, politics and behavior. But before I say that, the most important stat for young people out of New Hampshire is that 5% less young voters came out in 2020 than in 2016 for Bernie Sanders. So he's losing his very base of support. But as it relates to politics and Democrats, as it relates to politics and as it relates to behavior, when you look at the policies that he's put into place, the lowest unemployment, 191 judges, when you look at the fact that he has renegotiated a deal with China and USMCA, people have siloed the politics with the behavior. Quite frankly, people have kind of...
It's back to Spencer's point, isn't it? It's not ideology. It's us that talk about ideology. Yeah.
Correct. I think people and voters now have kind of baked in his behavior. They assume he's going to say things on Twitter. They assume he's going to stick a knife in his person, you know, but I just think that people will look at the actual facts of what he's done policy.
All right, Nomiki, I've got 40 seconds very quickly for your response.
Yeah, I mean, first off, Bernie Sanders is the largest youth movement, largest young turnout in the history of Democratic primaries. So I think that number is not reflective of where we've moved in the last 4 years. Second, you know, it's going to become very clear, no matter who it is, Democrat, any of the Democrats versus Donald Trump, what Donald Trump's actual record is. I think when you look at the candidates, the person who is the most opposite of Donald Trump in terms of what he stands for and his record is Bernie Sanders, and that's going to be a huge win for him.
Okay, we've got to go. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.